Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Tuesday, April 30th, 2024. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Media commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
And joining us today, our old friend, Commentary Inc. trustee, co-author of The Genius of Israel and Startup Nation, and host of the indispensable Call Me Back podcast, Dan Senor. Hi, Dan.
Hey, John. Good to be with you.
Quickly, if you are not a subscriber to Call Me Back, you got to subscribe to Call Me Back today. Dan has put up in the last couple of hours an interview with Rachel Goldberg and John Poland, the American-Israeli Olim, moved to Israel. We're actually quite much more recently than I had realized based on your podcast, maybe 12, 13 years ago.
Well, they moved when Hirsch, their son, who's now being held hostage, they moved when he was 8 years old, and he's 23 now.
He's 23 now, so that's 15 years. They were Chicagoans. They lived in Richmond, Virginia. Hirsch was born in Berkeley, California. He is an American, according to Rachel. In this podcast, English is his preferred language, though, of course, he is an Israeli immigrant, and so he speaks fluent Hebrew. And the Proof of Life video that was released of him last week has him speaking entirely in Hebrew, which Rachel seems to have found jarring in an interesting way, because that's not the language that he speaks to. They speak English to him, and she describes once again the emotional devastation of the experience of being a hostage parent, of all the things that have been going on in the last 2 weeks. This 18-nation statement condemning the keeping of hostages, and it's a wonderful, meaningful, variegated interview. It is a must, as is this Sheryl Sandberg video that you can now watch on YouTube, that the former number two at Facebook made, a documentary she made in Israel after October 7th about the about the events and the abuse of women, called "Screaming into Silence," which is also a necessary watch.
Screams before silence.
Excuse, "Screaming Before Silence." I apologize. Yeah.
I just say, just real quick on Rachel and John. I think, the interview captures a lot, not the least of which is that Rachel says that there was a lot about Hirsch in that interview that was in that video that was unrecognizable to her. Also, the way he speaks. She said he was very laid back. He's a very laid back guy. He never gets animated. He never gets angry. He's like yelling in the video. She made some comment like, I don't know how many takes it took to get him to do that. But she also, they both react to the college campuses, the U.S. college campuses, in terms of going what they're going through and then watching the insanity over here. And then John, because this is an issue that comes up a lot. Should this government stay in power? Shouldn't it stay in power? Should there be elections? The Israeli government. And while not taking a position or explaining his views of the government, because obviously that's not their focus right now, he does make it. He's quite explicit that he thinks Israel going to elections right now would be a real setback, which I think is interesting, because that's not what you often hear from the various protesters in Israel and from some other members of the hostage movement.
We got to get to that, because we really want your impressions. You just got back. Last week represented the ultimate in cognitive dissonance in the discussion of what is going on inside Israel. And I think it's fair to say that it'll be 7 months next week since October 7th. And I think it's fair to say that the Israeli public is being driven crazy effectively by Hamas, which is a very clever and resourceful psychological terrorist organization, as well as being a very effective terrorist, almost conventional army, let's say, because with the release of the Hirsch Goldberg Poland interview, on the eve, it appeared on the eve of Israel saying, "Okay, we've had enough. We're going into Rafah and ending this war." Uh, the political discussion inside the country was immediately upended or paralyzed or complicated or made emotionally much more devastating because of the nature of the threat that is represented by the video release, which is, here's somebody you might actually thought was dead. We saw him being driven off with a blown off hand. How could he survive this in captivity for so long? No, he's alive. And negotiations are going on to release the hostages. And Israel's preparing to go in to do its final siege of Hamas's last stronghold. And that, combined with the two other hostage videos released over the weekend, has just thrown the national conversation into a kind of emotional maelstrom. And can you give us a sense of what that's like as you went around this week during Pesach?
It was this is my third trip to Israel since October 7th. And it was, for the reasons you're saying and others, the strangest, because you, in one sense, you could walk around Israel and you'd think, Israel's back. It's booming, it's bustling. We were in Jerusalem for the Seder at my sister's, and we spent one afternoon in Jerusalem to go to the new National Library, which is an extraordinary place, by the way, if you haven't been, the National Library of Israel. But other than that, we spent the week in Tel Aviv and traveled south. And you walk around Tel Aviv, it's like the bars, the restaurants, lines around the block to get into these places, music, the beach. I mean, the beach was just totally like you, if you knew nothing, if you were in a news blackout and you just parachuted into Tel Aviv, you could think it was October 6th. So on the one hand, that's going on. And then on the other hand, almost every conversation you have with anyone, anywhere, is about everything you just talked about. Rafah, no Rafah. Hostages alive, hostages not alive. It's just, complaints about the government, defense of the government, depending on who you're talking to. It's just, everything is just there. And so, I mean, I got to tell you, anyway, I spent time with families who have hostages in Gaza, not just Rachel and John, and also with soldiers who are, a friend of ours, a boyfriend is a reservist. He was in Gaza for 3 months, and he's been out for the last couple months, and he's getting ready to go back in. I mean, he's a combat reservist. He's 26 years old. They're what they call prepping. They're in prepping mode right now, with the understanding that they're going back in. Presumably, he can't say exactly what they're working on, but it sounds like he's going into Rafah. And I don't need to tell you guys, he's a 26-year-old guy, impressive, delightful, and you just think,
I've told this story before. My nephew alone will turn 39 this year, and he's gone back in. He went in after 3.5 months in Gaza at the beginning of the war. He had come home, and he went back a week ago Wednesday, and then was sent home for the weekend, presumably because they were pausing whatever it was that they had called him up to do. But he is either back or about to go back, and he is, as I say, he is approaching his 40th birthday. So that's how serious this is. Now, he was a combat soldier in a very elite unit, and so therefore is a particularly valuable reservist. There are, I don't know how many reservists there are. 400,000.
Yeah, well, they don't publish it. Yeah,
right. But I mean, but it's not like they're bringing the entire country is just simply marching back into Gaza, having left Gaza. But there is a sense of expectation that the second phase of this battle is about to begin, except for the fact and we get moved from the street level into the government level, there are these bizarre things going on with theoretical negotiations with Hamas taking place, in which Israel puts offers on the table that Hamas rejects, and then everybody says, okay, put another offer on the table. And then the government puts another offer on the table. They started with 40, not, by the way, the entire 133 hostages, alive or dead, by the way, because Israel does not draw a particular distinction between the living and the dead, in the sense that Jewish law obliges not only the returning of the hostages and the ransoming of the hostages, but the proper burial of a dead Jew. And there are also a bunch of hostages there, as Rachel Poland Goldberg talks about, who are not Jewish.
Yeah.
In
fact, in the interview,
Nepalese.
I didn't know this. She told me that they have she wouldn't say the name because she doesn't want to cause problems for the family, but she told me there's a Muslim family, an Israeli Arab family that they Rachel and John have become very close with since October 7th, who also have a kid in Gaza.
Yeah, and Nepalese. There are Nepalese in it. So, but Jewish law obliges a proper Jewish burial, and so you're not only ransoming for the living hostages, you were also ransoming for the hostages that Hamas has obviously killed.
I mean, Ruby Chen, whose son, he was one of the outspoken members of this group of American families who have hostages in Gaza, like Rachel and John. He's part of that group. He's originally from Long Island. I'm actually seeing him today. He's in New York. So his son was in a tank, soldier, right by the border on October 7th, and he was quote unquote taken hostage. And so I got to know him through his advocacy, dealing with the hostage crisis over the first few months after October 7th. He has been told, this is publicly reported about 2 months ago, that his son was killed, that the Israeli intelligence knows now that his son is dead. And it sounds like he was killed on actually October 7th, but they took his body into Gaza. And Ruby still has not had a funeral for his son or a memorial service. He's still an active member of the hostage families movement, working to get his son's bodies back, and he will not proceed with the burial, obviously not the burial process, or any kind of memorial service, or any kind of mourning. I mean, religious mourning. I'm sure he's mourning, but the religious process, the formal religious process of mourning, until he gets the actual body back. So he's like living. I mean, he goes to all these meetings with the hostage families. He was at the White House. It's as though his son. Anyways.
Again, it's the intersection of a liberal democracy where the individual is paramount, and therefore the fate of the individual is paramount. The rights of the individual are paramount, and ancient Jewish law, which says that the body of a dead Jew must be prepared for proper burial in the ground. To the extent that there's an organization in Israel that was protested against at a synagogue in Englewood, New Jersey, a couple weeks ago. All these things are coming so fast and furious. We have these moments of outrage that we forget because they're replaced by new outrages. But this group, and this is true after terrorist attacks and everything like that, literally goes around to scrape up bits of remains, DNA test them to see to whose body they belong, so that those remains can be buried along with the body, because the body is supposed to be as complete and whole as possible to receive a proper Jewish burial. And Hamas, of course, knows that the dead hostages are in some sense as valuable as the living hostages, and is playing on Israeli emotions like a piano. So we have this negotiation.
John, I just want to say one other very quick, because it's these stories. They say they say as much about Israel, it's the beauty and the complexity of Israel. This what we're talking about right now is like anything you can imagine because it gets to the core of how we think about life and death. Someone from the Mossad back in December told me, I mean, this is really both sort of fascinating and crazy. When the Israeli military intelligence and the Mossad find what they would consider, what any liberal secular democracy would consider sufficient evidence of someone's a casualty of someone dead, the deceased in Gaza. They find body parts, they find whatever evidence, DNA. I don't know what they find, but they find that they are able to make a determination as the military has been moving through Gaza that this body, that or this person, that person. You have meetings sometimes between the Mossad and rabbis to determine whether or not what they have found meets the threshold of officially declaring under Jewish law the person dead. So is it appropriate to go to the parents and say, hey, we found, well, what did you find? Well, we found, well, under Jewish law, that doesn't necessarily mean they're dead. So do you say, well, we think they're dead, but they're not, but we can't officially declare them dead? I just imagine an intelligence agency and rabbis meeting to have these debates about how to resolve this. It is otherworldly.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about the politics. Go ahead.
Just before we get to the politics, just to get back to Dan's experience there, of Israel at the moment. I'm curious, in these interactions, and you said, people are discussing essentially the things we're talking about here, Rafah, hostages. Did you get a sense that generally those you spoke with were leaning one way or the other? Yet we have to go in, we can't go in, we've got to work on the hostages, or do they tend to be on an individual level torn mostly?
I think that question is not as binary for most Israelis as it's being reported here. So like when you listen to the reporting out of the Biden administration via their stenographer, Tom Friedman, they you get the impression that they're now. I think Friedman oversimplifies it. I really do. I talk about this.
No, really,
a conversation I'm having.
He lacks complexity.
It's not what his cab driver said.
His cab driver in Singapore told him.
Yeah.
Anyways, that's not what his cab driver said.
Yeah, he talks to two people. He talks to crown princes and cab drivers.
Cab drivers. It's always Singapore. I'm always struck by Singapore or Shanghai. It's one of those two. His most recent column, which made a lot of news, I think ridiculously in Israel, because it talked about about the U.S. suspending arms sales, the Biden wanting or considering suspending arms sales if Israel goes into Rafah. What he really captures, by the way, is a debate inside the administration, and there is a faction within the administration who is advocating for that. They appear right now to be the losing faction in the internal administration debates. It's not where the White House is, but he reports it like that's the only plan on the table, which is not accurate. But he reports it all like there's a scenario where Israel can just end this if it wants to, and then just like forget about Rafah. Like Rafah's there. There's 4 Hamas battalions there. If you think about the scattered fighters from other battalions that have been crushed, you could probably add up another couple battalions worth of fighters. So, and they're mostly in Rafah, and obviously the Hamas leadership is probably in Rafah.
How many are in a Hamas battalion? Do we know how they number their?
It's something between 800 and 1,000.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So, but that's just an estimate. And so the idea, but whatever that is, first of all, those battalions in Rafah are assumed to be the most well-trained and most lethal of the 24 plus battalions. It is understood that those battalions plus the leadership, the political leadership in Rafah, would form the nucleus of a Hamas 2.0 if Hamas if Israel just walks if they just end this, that this will be the nucleus that could reconstitute itself and retake over Gaza. So the idea that Israel could just okay, we're done, and not have a real plan for this thing that's there. Oh, by the way, this thing is Israel's equivalent of Osama bin Laden. Imagine Osama bin Laden and 4 battalions of Al Qaeda are they're in Staten Island, but we're done in Manhattan. We've cleaned up, we're done. We're kind of, but they're still there, and we'll just kind of, and when I say this to Americans, I'm like, you get that no Israeli, I was just there, no Israeli thinks that they can just, the ones that want to move forward on a hostage deal, they don't think that the thing can just end. And so people say, well, we can send in an Arab, peacekeeping force that can go kind of be in Gaza and provide the security, even if that, and I say this now all the time. Which country is sending their soldiers into Gaza when there are still 4 Hamas battalions? You see, the U.S. is building this port, this humanitarian port. It gets no press attention. Yeah, the pier. It's getting no attention. There are rockets being fired at it, at American. I mean, you think the Saudis or the Emiratis or the Bahrainis or the Kuwaitis are going to be like, yeah, our guys are just going to be roaming around Gaza while Hamas is still there? So it's Israelis. Yes, there is this choice. I mean, Nachum Barnea, who's a prominent columnist in Israel, Hebrew language columnist, wrote this piece over the weekend where he basically says there are 3 scenarios for Israel now, which is Rafah and no hostages, hostages and no Rafah, or the one that I think is most worrisome is no Rafah, no hostages. Basically, Rafah, Israel has no plans for Rafah, and the hostage issue doesn't get resolved. I'm skeptical that the hostage issue is going to get resolved either way. But I just think most Israelis believe there's some version of what was done in the first hostage deal, which is there's a pause, and there's a pause on going into Rafah. And the only way you do the pause going into Rafah is you convince Hamas that you're ready to go into Rafah, which they have been doing. And then you get a hostage deal. And the hostage deal creates this temporary ceasefire, and then Israelis go back to finishing after the end of that temporary ceasefire. Now, the problem with that is I don't think Hamas will accept anything within what is within a reasonable time frame for what Israelis would consider a temporary ceasefire. They want an end.
But we should talk about where the deal is, and then we can move on to scenario 4 that Nachum Barnea does not lay out, which is where the deal is it was 40 hostages. And again, remember, I said there are 133 unaccounted for. So Israel is only asking, weirdly enough, is only asking for 40, or came to the table with the idea that they could get 40. Then the number dropped to 33.
But that was because they believed at the time that there were still 40 living that fell into this humanitarian category. The humanitarian category are women, children, elderly, and any Israelis that are medically vulnerable, medically fragile. So that's how they got the 40 number.
Right, but again, I mean, the number could have been 133, but it wasn't. They could have said, the deal we're going for is the release of all hostages, but that's not even where they were. They already negotiated with themselves downward to a third of the hostages that are still unaccounted for. Then they went to 33. Oh, Hamas said no to 40, and a release. Well,
Hamas said we can't. Hamas said we can't produce 40. That was
we can't produce 40. Right, okay,
we can't produce 40 that fall into that category.
Right, but that doesn't mean they couldn't produce 40.
No. Israel went immediately back and said, "Fine, get to the 40 number by producing some outside of the humanitarian."
Yeah, right. And then they said no, and then Israel dropped the number to 33, and Hamas said no. And now we read in the public prints overnight or yesterday that the deal is down to 20, and Antony Blinken will be in Israel today, serving as one of the Rosado brothers. Now, the Rosado brothers are a family in the Godfather universe, and they are hostages. So the idea is the Rosado brothers go when there is a negotiation over returning two mafia families are at war, and somebody needs to return somebody, and the Rosado brothers go and they serve as replacement hostages. And then if anything happens to the Rosado brothers, all the 5 families go and kill the family that does anything. They're professional hostages. And Tony Blinken is there, announced he was going last week. Why? To keep Israel out of Rafah. I don't know what other conceivable purpose he has to have meetings in Israel, to be in Israel, except last week when it looked like they might go in, he's saying, okay, I'm going to come on Tuesday. So obviously they can't go in with Blinken on the way and staying there. And then who knows what happens after Tuesday. So the offer's down to 20. There are 2 ways of looking at this. One of which is Netanyahu is trying to show, or the government is trying to show, that there is no deal possible, that they will go as far as humanly possible to do whatever they can to get just like a smidgen of hostage release in exchange for some kind of a ceasefire and Palestinian prisoners going, so that as far as I can tell, American liberals won't be mad at them, or will be less mad at them, or they want to show that they're reasonable and Hamas is unreasonable.
Well, they are getting these favorable statements out of the administration now. The administration is saying that Israel's given the most generous offer, and yeah.
So the question is, Israel's given the most generous offer. They really think Hamas should take the deal. They really hope. I mean, it's such a reasonable deal, as though they are dealing with people on 2 sides of a negotiation over the sale of an office building. Look, there are some problems with the underlying, land lease of the building. I mean, he's going the extra mile to make the deal so that you guys can come to the table and everybody is going to win. Come to the table. It's a good deal. Hamas is a terrorist, irredentist, millenarian, authoritarian, jihadist organization. It does not have the same negotiating wants and needs as people who care about the living. So this is a fascinating moment.
John,
let's say the deal. Let me just ask you, Dan, and if the deal falls apart again, which I think we presume it will, at what point does America say, okay, go into Rafah?
Yeah.
I mean, isn't the predicate of the American praise for Israel and being so reasonable and responsible that if the deal falls apart, there's no longer any rational objection to Israel finishing Hamas off? But that's not going to happen.
2 things. One, there's another sort of surround sound element, which is Hamas is no doubt somehow, just based on the statements they've issued, so we know this to be true, they are monitoring the craziness over here, right? They put out statements in solidarity with their brothers in the campuses, in Hamilton Hall,
in Hamilton Hall at Columbia.
So they're watching this craziness over here. They're watching, obviously, the continued action at the UN. They have been watching statements out of the administration, although now they're getting better, but obviously for the last few weeks they have not been good. They are, we can go on and on with the parade of horribles. So they're seeing the pressure mounting on Israel. They don't see the pressure mounting on them. So the incentive to make a move is that they don't believe there's one there. Most of the Israelis who are dealing with this from a policy standpoint think that Hamas does not look around and think that Israel has the momentum now. They think that Hamas have the momentum because the world is just tightening and tightening and tightening the noose around Israel's neck. B, again, Senor at the end of the day wants one thing, which is to say that he launched the most devastating attack against Israel in its history, and he's still standing, and Hamas is still standing, and they're still in Gaza. So unless anything that involves him not being able to do that is a huge setback for him. Potentially, it's the end of everything, really, for Senor and the Hamas leadership. So what deal could they agree to that that could risk that happening to them? I just don't see Like it's at the end now. When they did the deal at the end of November, it was the war was in a much different phase, and the hostage situation was in a much different phase, and the world's pressure was at a much different. It had a much different focus. The world's pressure was more focused on Hamas than it is today. I just think the whole environment has changed.
Okay, so let's talk about the environment changing and what that means. We keep talking about analogies and parallels to 1968 and Colombia's this takeover last night after the 2 p.m. deadline laid out by the Colombia administration for the dismantling of the tent encampment came and went. Abe and I sat in my office. Abe found a basically Democracy Now! Far left-wing Twitter, YouTube feed of a guy inside the encampment. We basically had it on in our office, watching to wait to see the cavalry come in and take out the tent city. And guess what? Nothing happened. And we saw these schleps, and I mean schleps, like they look like schleps, and there weren't that many of them, maybe 60, walking in a circle or from the south lawn to the north lawn. In a circle. That was their march, and it really was very sparsely populated and not impressive at all, and led me to think, well, people just walk in and start taking the tents down. Some of them could have been on the other side of the lawn, and basically you could have taken those tents down in 2 minutes. Nothing happened, and then last night this building was in very eerie parallel to the images on January 6th. Glass smashed, people going in, occupying Hamilton Hall, a major classroom building at Columbia, and occupying it. So it is now occupied by.
Can we add a couple data points to that? It wasn't just occupied. They unfurled a banner that said, introducing Heinz Hall. They've renamed it Heinz Hall after a Palestinian child who was I think supposedly killed. Glory to all our martyrs. And I think it's important to note that is the same phrase that was projected onto a building at George Washington University's campus a few months ago. It is being seen in a lot of these campus protests, and they are replacing, as they did on Harvard's campus, the American flag with the Palestinian flag. Right. So this kind of occupation is not just pro-Palestinian. It is obviously anti-American in the same way that in the 60s, I think we saw that.
The reason I bring this up is that Columbia in 1968 was the epicenter of student protest in the United States. And from it emerged the most radical elements of the anti-Vietnam War movement, meaning the Weathermen, the actual terrorists, who then spearheaded a bombing campaign inside the United States that, according to Brian Burrow, led to almost 1,200 domestic bombings in 1971. So that's Colombia, right? And did the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong know what was going on in the United States in 1968 as a presidential election was coming on strong that year? And all sorts, did they know that they had an influential and important and elite body of opinion that had turned on America and wanted to, and was basically on their side, and that this toughened their position as a negotiating partner? Absolutely it did.
Well, and
and that's what's happening here.
But it's a choice, because unlike in the 60s, where I'm sure there were universities that did crack down, we now, thanks to social media, know that instant crackdowns work. We've seen this on campuses. The best one, the big shout out to Ben Sass at the University of Florida, who issued a statement, which was great. He said, the University of Florida is not a daycare. We do not treat protesters like children. They knew the rules. They broke the rules. They'll face the consequences. That is leadership. And that is awesome. I mean, we need to see that everywhere. And so but it's really notable that the place that is not happening, where administrators are not acting, are the most elite campuses. That's where it's not happening.
So I'll tell you guys a crazy story, just parenthetically. About 3 weeks ago, before this latest round of craziness, maybe 3 weeks ago, before I went to Israel, I had 2 speaking events within 24 hours. One was at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and the other was at Duke University. At Ann Arbor, I was doing a session with Naftali Bennett, the former Prime Minister of Israel. The hall we had was seated like 1,000 people. They're expecting it to be completely filled. The Students for Justice in Palestine group hacked the ticketing system and managed to get most of the tickets for the event, and we're planning to completely shut down the event. And everyone got spooked, including the Michigan University of Michigan security, and the Michigan security folks said they can't provide sufficient security, and they advised the administration that the event should be canceled. And while Bennett and I are in Michigan, and then there's pushback from the Jewish student group, and back and forth. They finally agreed, okay, we'll still support the event. We can't provide security to prevent the event from being shut down. We'll move the event to, quote unquote, an undisclosed location. Okay, so then they had us go to this undisclosed, okay, and we'll have 75 seats. That the tickets are hand delivered to the select group of 75 handpicked Jewish students, and they'll only be given the address of the event at like 3:15 p.m. The event was at 4 or something, and then for everyone else, we'll live stream it, and we'll never declare where this is. So here we are in 2024 with a former democratically elected prime minister of Israel, who, oh, by the way, was not only the prime minister, but he was the prime minister of probably the most pluralistic government in Israel's history, which included leaders from the right,
Arab party,
hard left, an Arab Muslim party. I mean, it's just like, and he comes to speak on an American campus and has to be told you can only speak in an undisclosed, even that term,
from a bunker,
from a bunker. I mean, just think, you couldn't imagine any other leader, like any other leader of any other country, having to go through this, and the security saying, look, we can't, there's nothing we can do, and the administration, as opposed to the administration saying, I don't care if you don't have enough security personnel, then hire off-duty cops. Like, we are not letting students shut down events. And I spoke to a Times reporter after the event who was following all of this because he was writing about it, a New York Times reporter. And he told me this particular group at the University of Michigan, this is their MO, which I didn't realize it because it was my first interaction with this whole situation at University of Michigan. Any Jewish event, they just try to shut it down. That's like the thing they're doing. They're preventing the events from happening. Now, I go from Michigan to North Carolina to speak at Duke. Night and day, 24-hour period. 400 people at the event. Frank Bruni, who you guys know, who teaches at Duke, moderates the event. He's a professor at Duke while he's still writing for the Times. He moderates the event. The group is respectful. He does ask me tough questions. It's not like but it's not, no one's demonstrating. There's no disruptions. The event just happens like quite norm. It felt in this environment like it was another era. Like, it just all felt normal. And I would ask around, like, well, how do you, and there are obviously a number of inputs as to why it's not happening, but one of them is the administration just doesn't tolerate it. Like, they're just not going to tolerate this kind of chaos and anarchy. And so, again, look, Duke's a smaller school, Michigan's a big school. Duke's a private school, the University of Michigan's a state school. I think Duke has probably fewer international students than Michigan. I mean, there's probably a million reasons why, but one necessary, maybe not sufficient, but necessary input is, to Christine's point about Ben Sass, like, the administration says it just ain't gonna happen. We're not letting events get shut down. No one's giving talks to students from a bunker. And so
right.
It was like,
and there are consequences. They know the rules. I mean, Sass was good, actually. He said, these are the rules. If you break them, these are the consequences. And then they enforce it. I mean, it's funny. My kids are about to go off to college. I was thinking about when they were toddlers, and I'm like, yeah, you have to, like, you're like, if you do this will happen, but you have to make the thing happen if they break the rule. And that's what we're not seeing on many, many, many of these campuses.
Well, I mean, it's almost a comic that Manoush Safik for the second said 2 o'clock,
2 p.m.
and you're
folks.
done, and you're all getting suspended, and the tent encampment is being taken down. When we were watching the footage, Abe and I, yesterday, of the campus, they're putting risers up. They have on this lawn near the tent encampment, there are piles and piles of chairs, because commencement is next week or something like that. They have to set up.
Yeah, but these commandments are all going to get. These commandments are all going to get canceled.
But okay, so the commencement at USC was canceled.
But these groups want them canceled too. It shows their power,
of course. But Columbia has brought out the equipment, the raw materials necessary to create the conditions for a commencement.
That's a provocation that makes the protesters feel unsafe, John. Don't you know? This is
without question. So they're marching around, and the chairs are standing there on the lawn, and Manoush Safik is in the witness protection program. I mean,
by the way, where is she? In all seriousness, my Campbell just asked me this morning. Yeah. Where is she?
She's curled up in a ball on the floor of her
surrounded by lawyers.
Saying, why did I take this job? Why did I take this job? My life was, I just went to conferences and people were really nice to me. And now I have no future. I mean, talk about a person with no future. She has no future. There is no getting beyond this. And this is the other point about this, which is, it's now May, so schools are about to, basically call it a year. What possible incentive do these leaders have of the protests for not regathering in September when school comes back? There's going to be a long hot summer.
I'll give you a different scenario, John.
Okay, yeah.
I spoke to yesterday someone who's very involved in Democratic politics, Biden reelect stuff. And they're looking at all this and saying, okay, so all these students are at it. Their numbers are growing. They're feeling empowered. But unfortunately for them, the circus has to come to a close in a matter of weeks because these campuses are going to empty out because school is over. But they have all this energy and they feel that they have momentum. Where are they going to go? Chicago, that toddling town with a
conventions,
and they're watching all of this and saying this whole show is moving to Chicago.
Right now, and here's the interesting thing to contrast to 1968, where of course the Chicago Convention was overrun by Vietnam War demonstrators in Grant Park across from the Conrad Hilton Hotel, which is where the convention took place in 68. And of course, there was a conventional old-time machine mayor, Richard Daley, who sent the cops in, and the cops got violent and beat up protesters, and the protesters beat up the cops, and the Chicago 7 were arrested, and all of that became this legendary moment. Well, Chicago now has a mayor who isn't going to do any of that. He's not going to send in the cops. He's not going to beat anybody up.
So
yeah.
And I can, I think he said this publicly. People like David Axelrod, who have a long history in Chicago Democratic politics, have expressed real concern about this mayor, that he is not going to take this stuff on.
Right now, in 2004, when Michael Bloomberg was mayor of New York, and the left was up in arms about Iraq and didn't like Bush because of 2000, didn't like Bush, period. And Michael Bloomberg was mayor of New York, and they created this immensely complicated system to deal with the demonstrators at Madison Square Garden where the convention was
and it worked.
Place.
I remember that convention. It worked.
They did. And by the way, and then there were hundreds of arrests with zip ties, and then the arrests were basically the charges were dismissed. But the whole idea was, for these 4 days, we are not going to let you. We'll deal with the consequences later. We're not going to let you disrupt this. This is very important to us. And clearly, Brandon Johnson, it will do nothing. And so we're going to have not the 1968 Richard Daley fiasco, which created conditions of chaos that helped Richard Nixon get elected in 1968. You're going to have the opposite. You're going to have Manoush Safik in Grant Park. You're going to have Manoush,
but you will have a contrast by then, because correct me if I'm wrong, but the Republican convention is in Milwaukee in July. So we'll see how that goes and if there's any protest. Right. It's in August in Chicago. It'll be quite a contrast for voters if one goes smoothly and the other is chaos.
Yeah. Except yes, smoothly, but I do think there's a world in which these protesters could go to Milwaukee.
Yes, I'll be curious.
They can go to Milwaukee. Milwaukee's an hour and a half from Chicago, and then they can all walk to Chicago. Because the convention in Chicago is, I think, 2 weeks later. I mean, the idea that this is going to end at any time soon, there is literally no incentive.
It's also not going to end, because something that the protesters are doing here is they're demonstrating one of the fundamental challenges of trying to fight their heroes, the actual terrorists, which is what they share with them is that they want escalation. When the administration says we're going to bring in the cops, we're going to suspend you, that they get excited, because that means that they're getting more attention. That means that they can cry military tactics were used, much like Hamas welcomed an Israel assault, so they could then say, "Look, world, look what the mean Israelis are doing to us."
Absolutely. Okay, let's get back to Israeli politics if we can, because our time is growing short. So I said I thought there was a fourth scenario from Nahum Barnea's scenario, and the Israeli body of public opinion that is dealing with the incredibly harsh choice that is now being proffered to Israel, which the effective threat that is posed by the Proof of Life videos this week, which is go in and we're going to kill the hostages, or the hostages will die in this siege. So just be aware, they're here, their lives are hang by a thread. We're capable of. There's a fourth force, and that is it's all Bibi's fault. So there is this world in Israel in which there are protests that are simply follow-ons to the protests against the Netanyahu government that went on for 9 months in Tel Aviv. The area where the protests took place in Tel Aviv has become Hostage Square. So the center of the protests, Kaplan Street, has now become the place where you go to kind of pay tribute to, or try to commune with, or have sort of like a common experience about the hostages. Posters everywhere. People give concerts. It's sort of a communal area. So and so.
By the way, for anyone who hasn't been to Israel since October, I do recommend going. I advise going. It's quite
absolutely. It's a startling experience. Yeah. I mean, I was there at the end of November, so I haven't been there since. But anyway, but you can say, well, the hell with all this. It's Bibi's fault. Bibi is a fascist, and he's a monster, and he did this and he did that. And you actually weirdly have it from both sides, which is to say, on the one hand, you have the Israeli sort of liberal left that had decided that he was doing undemocratic, monstrous things, and spent 9 months protesting him, having won a completely legitimate election and gotten the first honest majority a government had in Israel since 2015. You have them, and then you have people on the right who are, he's feckless, he mishandled everything, he took his eyes off the ball. Hamas should have been deterred. He forgot to deter Hamas. He was like going for the big enchilada, which was the Abraham Accords, and he did not do his job. Now, so weirdly enough, protests are going on, and you have some hostage families who are protesting outside the prime minister's house, and their message, which is bring the hostages home, is weirdly mixed in with pre-October 7th Israeli politics. It's just, we hate Bibi, and then this happened, and so we hate Bibi even more because now there are hostages, and he didn't do that, and he didn't do this, and he's not doing anything right. And so that creates a kind of emotional third place, right? Which is Israelis are facing an impossible choice. You gave the Barnett, which is going into Rafah and losing the hostages, or being threatened with the loss of the hostages, or not going into Rafah and probably not getting very many of the hostages back anyway. But there is this other outlet, emotional steam, valve outlet, which is, I hate Bibi, and it's all Bibi's fault. And that seems to be where the confusion also is building up, because Bibi is the dove in this situation. If you want the hostages out at any cost, Bibi is pursuing almost the policy, although I think he's pursuing it because he thinks Hamas will accept no deal. So there's almost no reason not to put the most ridiculous terms on the table because they'll say no to everything, Dan, like you said, because Senor just wants to remain standing, and any capitulation or seeming capitulation will harm his reputation. But Bibi's on their side. Bibi is not. I mean, if you want the hostages out, Bibi is not the one who is saying, "I don't want to do this." His government is sweetening and sweetening and sweetening the deal, but that doesn't really matter to Israeli public opinion in some sense because this is just the fourth. This is the way that they are letting off the, I can't believe that we're facing this horrible, tragic situation. Also, like, thousands of Israelis are going to go into Gaza. That is, Rafah, that is going to be a difficult, painful, and bloody operation. And many Israelis are going to lose their lives. They have to go into those tunnels. They don't know what the tunnels are like in Rafah. They don't have a diagram of the tunnels. It's like a horror movie.
Oh, so it's added because you're up against the Egyptian border. So there's Egyptian military right there. So the amount of complexity with deconflicting with the Egyptian military, so Israel doesn't accidentally kill a bunch of Egyptian soldiers. I mean, it's
really awful, right? So then there is this Bibi, this fourth thing, which is Bibi, and that's why I say the country is in a state of emotional. It's like just and so. The delay in going into Rafah, I think, which is now 2 months long, if not longer, was sort of an existential mistake because it's only made everything worse inside the country in terms of its mood, and obviously here, not that Israel should care about what's going on in American college campuses.
Well, if Biden thought Israel's going to go into Rafah anyways, is he kicking himself for saying I should have let them go in 3 months ago, long before Chicago?
Yeah, no, he's just going to blame the Jews. Like that's in the end, that's the other option, which is what the whole planet does, which is this is all terrible. Let's blame the Jews. So as in from time immemorial. That's where you go with this. I mean, Jesus, if they had just given them a state, it's like, oh yeah, they tried in 2000. Oh, well, that doesn't count or whatever. It doesn't really matter. So the Bibi, I hate Bibi thing. I just looked this up and, Bibi, I don't know. I don't believe that Bibi will survive long. And I just looked this up because I had forgotten. I think everybody who thinks about the analogy that a lot of people have drawn to England taking its off or pursuing the policy of appeasement in the 1930s, the literal stated policy of appeasement in the 1930s to German ambitions. And then, of course, September 1st, 1939 happened. Germany invades Poland. And Neville Chamberlain, the author of the policy of appeasement, says he was wrong and that he had gotten it wrong and that they had done wrong. He did not fall. Like in your imagining, if this were a movie, Chamberlain would have said, I resign, and Winston Churchill, the backbencher, marches forward in the House of Commons, takes over, and he then becomes prime minister. That didn't happen. Churchill didn't become prime minister until May 1940, when the Battle of Britain began, when the Germans began bombing London. And that's a long period of time. That's September.
Golda Meir, John, was prime minister for long after the Yom Kippur War.
That's right. Yeah, she in the middle of 1974, I think, wasn't it? It was like June or July. So Bibi is going to fall, in my opinion. But this insane idea that he should fall in the middle of a crisis. You want a political. Now, by the way, if he fell tomorrow. If one of the right-wing parties run by Itamar Ben-Gvir or Bezalel Smotrich pulled out of the coalition and crashed his government, Bibi would remain prime minister. Not only when a new election had been held and a new majority had been formed.
Which takes months. The election takes months, and then the negotiations over a new government can take months.
Yeah, so he'll still be prime minister until the end of this phase of the conflict with Hamas, which, if it ended with Hamas's defeat, would then be the cap on his career, and then he would almost certainly resign or quit, or his government would fall on the grounds that somebody really had to pay the piper. Oh, the Golda Meir thing, which is not going to happen to him, is Golda
she got
Meir,
reelected.
She not only did she get reelected, she was cleared by the commission that studied the crisis that led to the Yom Kippur War. You know that's not going to happen with the commission that investigates October 7th. Bibi is going to get tagged and nailed.
But John, I think the big difference is the protest movement that you're seeing now and that you're describing is, I think some of the people involved with the protests want to just make it a continuation of 2023 of the judicial reform protests, and it's not. It's fundamentally different. It doesn't have the same energy. It doesn't have the same focus, and it doesn't resonate with the same number of people as the judicial reform protest did. What was so impressive, regardless of what you think of the substance, what was so impressive about the judicial reform protests or the anti-judicial reform protests is the organizers of it were extremely disciplined about making it about one thing. It was about stopping judicial reform, full stop, meaning lots of people came to those protests with a lot of other agendas, right? And we need to deal with the Haredim, and there were some people who want to say, well, we need to pursue a peace process, and we need better rights, more rights for Israeli Arabs, and more self-determination for for Palestinians, and everyone came with their causes, and the organizers of the movement early on said, stop. We are doing three things. We are protesting one issue, which is judicial reform, and that's it. 2, we're going to have Israeli flags everywhere. 3, we are going to sing Hatikva. We are going to be patriotic and focused. And that was, in many respects, the genius of that movement. And it worked, by the way. And it was successful because they had a very clear goal.
And it was a movement of adults. It was a movement of adults, upper middle class and upper middle class people who were coming out on Saturday night for a big party. And everybody was invited, and it was fun, and there were falafel stands, and people were cooking, and there was music. And now here in the United States, we have chaos, and we have psychotics
and destruction. There was no destruction. There was no vandalism. There was no violence. Right. Yeah. But I want to say what's happening now at efforts to turn 2023 into the new movement now is if you go talk to people who are trying to organize. I talked to a bunch of people who are going to some of these protests on my most recent trip. Well, why are you going? Oh, we need to bring the hostages home now. Okay, talk to someone else. Oh, the Haredi draft issue. We got to solve the Haredi. You talk to someone else. Oh, Bibi's got to go. You talk to someone else. It was like I counted at one point like 5 different causes that people thought they were going to protest about. And literally, they thought that's what the protest was about. So they're all showing up. And you literally say, so if I understand why the protest, how you could define success of the protest movement in 2023, it was unleashing enough heat on Bibi that he stops Yariv Levin as justice minister and the rest of them from pursuing judicial reform, and then it ends and it pauses. Like it was a very had a cause and effect, and again it worked. You ask these people, so the net out of this protest is what? Like, what happens? How do you measure success? They can't answer. They all have these different complicated answers on issues that have no connection to one another, and you don't have the turnout numbers. You just don't. I have a lot of friends who turned out in 2023 against the government on judicial reform, who hate this government and have told me, and I'll even say one of their names publicly because he's a public figure. Avi Sakharov. He's fresh in my mind because I just saw him last week. Avi Sakharov is really
the Fauda.
He's co-creator
of
Fauda.
Fauda, leading Israeli journalist for the last 20 years.
Yeah, Israeli journalist and television. Has created a bunch of film and TV projects, and he. But he's obviously, he makes it very clear. Go to his Twitter. He's extremely hostile to Netanyahu and this government. And he, by the way, he spoke at one of the biggest anti-judicial reform rallies in 2023. There's like this video that went viral of him on stage in front of like 150,000 people and gave a very powerful speech. And so he was like in the thick of it. He said to me, I don't feel comfortable going and protesting the government while there are soldiers fighting in Gaza. Like, it just doesn't feel right. Like, as much as I loathe this government, there's something about protesting your government when my fellow citizens are, and he, by the way, lost his stepdaughter's boyfriend, was one of the first casualties in the Gaza war, a few weeks into the war, and was very close with this kid. He's like, I'm not going to go out and protest the government while, and I have other family members who actually went to one of the protests 2 weeks ago, went to one of the protests. And this family member said to me, I got there, I wanted to show solidarity with some of the hostage families that were there protesting. So it just felt like being there for them. And then I got there and this person, she said, it didn't feel right. Like I didn't feel right in the middle of a war protesting the government, even though I hate this government, she said. And so she wound up standing to the side. Like she didn't feel like she wanted to be there to be supportive of the families, but she didn't want to actually be. So it's not the same. This thing doesn't have the same energy. It doesn't have the same focus. It doesn't have the same numbers. I'm skeptical that it's really going to go anywhere.
I want to just shift gears as we conclude to the Biden political organization and how it has handled things since October 7th, because it's getting more and more either mysterious or more and more of a sign of their fundamental incompetence and misreading of how power is harnessed and dealt with in a crisis situation. Biden showed moral resolution in the first 2 months of the war between Israel and Hamas. He said Israel has a right to defend itself. We stand with Israel. Hamas is an evil terrorist organization, and so on. And then the noises started coming about how dangerous this might prove to him in a close election in Michigan, because there are 400,000 Arab citizens of the United States living in Michigan who could vote. He only won Michigan by 150,000 votes, blah, blah, blah. And then this started steamrolling. Campuses weren't really aflame yet, but there was bad behavior going on at Harvard and other places. And of course, the presidents of those institutions were brought up before Congress, humiliated and disgraced themselves. 2 of the 3 leading Ivy League schools had their presidents have to resign. And had Biden shown simple moral resolution from then until now, I don't think that everything that is going on here, that I think is going to be very destructive to him, would have happened. If he had been John Fetterman, for example, the Democratic Party would have had...
Who, by the way, Fetterman is polling much higher right now in Pennsylvania than Biden is.
Right. If he had said, look, it's very simple. We have a Democratic ally with whom we have some disagreements and who are pursuing war aims that we support in general, but we have some problems with their execution of them. But we are on their side against this evil. And he had just stayed there. Would the campuses have gone up in flames? Would there have been moral direction from liberal administrators and people, not radicals, but liberal administrators who are more terrified of Donald Trump becoming president of the United States than anything? And if the guidance from the top of the food chain had been, we're standing with Israel. These guys are terrorists. This is their 9/11. We know what we did on 9/11.
Basically, Biden sounded like Kirby for the entirety of the last 7 months.
Yeah, his own spokesman, John Kirby. This is one of these counterfactuals that you have to ask yourself, because
you know what else is scary about
it? Just as, okay, I was just going to say, and then I want you to go, just as, Manoush Safik says, don't do it, and then they do it, and then she doesn't do anything, and then everything gets worse for her. Biden saying, I'm on Israel's side, but I'm not on this much, and it's like open spaces. They were opening spaces for people to run into and create chaos.
Yeah, and they created much more sympathy among non-radical liberals for the anti-Israel arguments. They lent them a sense of principle that they didn't actually have. One scary counterfactual possibility here is that, would the anti-Israel right have gotten louder and larger had Biden stayed as resolute as he was? Yeah.
That is a very interesting question, but I will say, because of course of this dynamic that we see, which if Biden says black, they say white. If Biden says this, if Biden says Trump is a criminal, they say Hunter Biden is a criminal. Like it's that kind of negative partisanship. But there is a backstop, and the people in the United States who most vociferously support Israel, not suburban Jews, is Christian evangelicals throughout the South, and that is also the Republican base, and there is a floor on the possibility of Republicans turning on Israel, even if the new right turns on Israel. Look, we saw the new right turn on Ukraine, and the aid package still passed, right? So this is a complicated matter.
I'll add one other layer, which I've been a broken record on this, and no one's listening, so whatever. I'll just say it again, and maybe you guys will listen. I just think I'm struck when I talk to my non-Jewish friends who follow news closely, who don't have any love for Israel. They don't have any hatred for Israel. They're just sort of not engaged with Israel. It's not it's not consuming their lives in any way. Israel's a news story, the way they follow any news story. They are completely rattled by the chaos, the campus stuff, because of the sense of disorder and the sense that everything's coming unglued. And so these pro-Hamas protests for them are a proxy for like things are just coming apart. And I think, and many of these people are the kind of people who voted for Romney or Obama in 2012. They probably voted for Clinton in 2016. I don't know how they voted in 2020. But the point is, they're up for grabs. They could go either way, and I think Biden has real risk of losing these people and a real opportunity to appeal to these people if he had his own sister soldier moment and he took on this craziness. What if he showed up at one of these campuses right now? If Biden showed up and said,
if you were Mike Johnson,
right?
If he did what Mike Johnson did,
His press secretary acknowledged that he hasn't even spoken to any of these, certainly not to the president of Colombia, given all the chaos. She was asked that question, I think, yesterday, and she's like, I don't have any information. Yeah, he's not involved at all.
It's unbelievable to me. To me, this is like, I'm not just saying this as it's the right thing to do. It's like it's like low-hanging fruit. By the way, he wouldn't have to say much. Just kind of doing one thing, saying one thing.
Yeah.
Would
all he'd have to do is go and say, I stand.
He should say pause.
Jewish. No, but all he says is, I stand with Jewish Americans and the Jewish students on this campus who have every right to go anywhere they want to. This is America, blah, blah, blah. Like, he wouldn't have to say, I don't like the goals of the protesters, and all he'd have to say is, there are disgraceful signs of anti-Semitic conduct on this campus. I stand for freedom and the American values of tolerance, and dating back to George Washington's letter to the synagogue and all of that. And again, a gimme, 5 minutes. He could go to the University of Delaware and they could find one person on his way to and from the airport that he could stand with. But they're scared. They're scared to do it. And because they got scared to do it, they have
fueled it.
Okay.
Can I ask you guys a question? Because I've been thinking about this. Does the steam run out? Like, does the energy just run out of this thing at some point? I've been thinking about George Floyd protests in 2020. Like, because I was trying to think the other day, how did those actually die down? I actually don't remember. Was it Biden getting elected that took that kind of took the urgency and the contagion of the thing out? I don't know what. Like, is there a world in which all
it got cold in Minneapolis? That was one thing.
Part of it was the weather.
Cold,
Part of it was the pandemic beginning to wind down.
Not winding down, it wound up. I mean, that was the thing. There was a break on the George Floyd protests, which was, you got to go back inside. Okay, we public health officials said that there's an exception to the
because there was another
rules.
wave. Right.
There was another way. That's right. I
Right.
think there was another way. But either way, it was like, okay, you had your fun. You went outside. We understand this was such an important issue. But the fact that 50 billion people were going to die from this virus was suspended so that everybody could go out into the streets for a little bit and
also,
talk about police brutality.
But do you know what else calmed it? They got what they wanted. They had their cause institutionalized. Right?
Yeah.
They got billions of dollars. They had all these new
DEI
programs set
jobs.
up. Yeah. And the organizers got rich. Yeah.
And the protesters here, by definition, can't get what they want.
Right.
They can get bits and pieces of what they want from individual schools kowtowing to them. But I mean, they're not going to get, America's not the schools are not going to divest. Right. This stuff isn't going to happen. And that's why I say, there's a summer, right? There's the summer and these conventions, and there's September. I mean, what is?
All right, let me give you an even worse scenario. Did you guys read this atrocious settlement agreement between the protesters and the administration at Northwestern?
Oh yeah.
Okay, I read that. I honestly found it unnerving to read. Like, as though the administration was dealing with a legitimate counterparty that they were negotiating with. And the terms of it were like, well, it literally says something like, well, the protest movement wanted the university to end all business ties with any Israeli affiliated businesses. We agreed that we'll have a committee that will make decisions on vending services and food services provided by the university. And on that committee, there will be representatives of the protest movement so like the kosher food vendor, if there's an Israeli working on that, then the committee members as part of this agreement get to vote I read this thing. I found this more than most things like so jarring that this was a real document. And I think that is going to give energy to all these other protest movements, that the more they protest, the more they're treated like a real thing.
Right. Well, the U.S. as a nation doesn't negotiate with terrorist organizations, but university presidents do. I mean, that's basically where we're at.
I don't even understand the term negotiation here. These aren't, you negotiate with an organization, right, that has members and this and that, whatever. Who are these people? They're a bunch of like ragtag radicals. They're not an organization. Kimani James, who wants to kill all Zionists and white people, is not the legitimate leader of a movement that he was elected or chosen to lead. He's just a psychopathic kid who wants to go out and kill people, particularly Jews, and thinks that he will one day move to a Hamas paradise that loves queer black people who are just going to welcome him with open arms. I mean, who are they negotiating with? You know what I mean? I mean, it's bizarre. I don't know. The counterparty is not an obvious person, and therefore, how could they? How? By the way, if the leadership went to the microphone at Northwestern University and said, "We have made a deal with the university which has given in to many of our demands, and we accept this deal," who's to say that 200 people who are in the tents are going to say, "Okay"? They don't work for them. There's no disciplinary authority over the people who are in the tents. Half the people in the tents are sort of hippies getting stoned. Half of them are, I think, psychotics who have been released from mental institutions. Who knows what happens then? But yeah, the fuel is being given every day. And the other thing is, when things really get tough, when Israel goes into Rafah and things are really tough, and there are going to be articles every day about the humanitarian horrors and all of that, then we'll see where the rubber meets the road. Are these people serious? Like, as Abe says, this isn't even about Gaza, like what's going on in Gaza, right? This is now about discrediting Israel or discrediting Jews or discrediting Zionism or something like that. But there will actually be a real thing happening. And I think that they might be, in a weird way, stopped short because it's all symbolic right now to them. And there'll be an actual thing, and they could actually kind of protest it, I suppose. But there's something about the actual act of military engagement that might like be a kind of cold slap in the face. That not that they won't reconstitute themselves and say Israel is terrible, but they've already said Israel's the worst thing ever. So how do they accelerate that? If Israel is a monstrous genocidal settler occupational colonial force that must be destroyed now, what happens when they go into Rafah? Like they've already exhausted their vocabulary. All right, so we're gonna bring this to a close, and I'm going to make the commentary recommends today, and I'm gonna recommend what I said at the beginning, which is I got nothing for you to read. I got nothing for you to. What you need to do is go listen to Dan's podcast, Call Me Back, with Rachel Goldberg and John Poland, just to remember what the stakes are, what actually happened. We're constantly in danger of losing the thread here because of everything that's going on and not focusing on the thing that happened, which is that a terrorist army invaded another country and killed 1,200 people and injured 3,500 and took 240 hostages away with them and changed world history as we know it with the effects that will have yet to be foretold. And you see it through the eyes of these two people who have had to endure the worst kind of suffering that I can imagine. Like, I feel like if somebody dies, you can mourn. If somebody is murdered, you never get over it, but you have a sense that something ends and another time begins. And as Rachel Goldberg says, it is though she is living in the middle of a car crash, and the car crash has been unending since the day she found out that Hirsch had been taken into Gaza. That she is still, the truck that rolled over her is still on top of her, but she has to persevere and go on. She has other kids. She's trying to represent her family and the hostage cause and all of that. But that this is the emotional experience that she is going through, and her stoicism is because she says, "I'm not stoic." I mean, she says, inside my body, inside my soul, I am not stoic at all, but I am taking on this role because I need to do what I can to save my son and also to save my country, which is I think what John, her husband, kind of gets at implicitly in the interview.
Can I just say one other thing that they both talk about, which I've never heard them talk about, the role that faith has played for them during all of this, which I thought is also important. That you can imagine people losing faith going through something like they're going through, and that the most meaningful and weirdly therapeutic periods for them is when they have been praying with their community. And they describe some of those moments, and I just thought that that's what they chose to focus on, was both, that's also brutal and shattering and yet beautiful.
Absolutely. Anyway, that's the Dan's Call Me Back podcast, available at Apple, Google Play, Stitcher, and wherever you get your fine podcast. You should listen to all of them. It's been, the greatest sort of like in-depth resource in American podcast land on everything that's happened since October 7th. But this is a particularly special and emotionally resonant one. So that's my commentary recommends. Dan Senor.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you as ever. And for Abe, we'll be back tomorrow. For Abe and Christine, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.